As a mother, I trusted my son with everything, until he took $50,000 and called it a gift. In that moment, he didn't just take my money, he took my trust, but I wasn't going to let him get away with it. He thought family meant forgiveness, but he didn't understand the weight of a signed agreement. I didn't just want my money back, I wanted control. By the time he came for what he thought he was owed, I had already made sure the papers would speak for me. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The air in the cafe was warm with the scent of freshly ground beans and cinnamon pastries, a smell Linda Harper normally found comforting. Today, it felt almost mocking. She had arrived early, claiming the corner booth beneath the large front window, the one that gave her a clear view of the entrance. The morning light filtering through the glass caught dust motes in the air and painted the table in pale gold. She had placed her tote bag beside her, the folder inside heavy with documents she had read too many times in the past week. Jason arrived 7 minutes late. He didn't hurry, he never did. He stepped inside with his sunglasses still on, scanning the room with that practiced air of someone who expected recognition. He wore a navy quarter zip, jeans that fit like they were tailored, and sneakers that probably cost more than Linda's monthly grocery bill. His smile was easy, the same boyish curve that had gotten him out of countless jams as a child. "Hey, Mom," he said as he slid into the seat across from her, placing his phone face up on the table as though it needed to be part of the conversation. Linda didn't waste time on pleasantries. "It's been 2 years since I lent you that money." Her voice was steady, but it carried the weight of every day she had waited for him to honor his promise. Jason leaned back, draping one arm over the back of the booth. "Time flies," he said with a grin. "We've been growing the business, building momentum." "I lent you $50,000, Linda reminded him. She let the figure settle in the air like a stone dropped into a pond. "You signed a note agreeing to repayment terms." Jason gave a casual shrug, his expression warm but dismissive. "Consider it a gift, Mom. I mean, it's family. You've always believed in me." Her jaw tightened, barely enough to be noticed, but enough that she could feel the muscle shift. "It wasn't a gift," she said quietly. Before Jason could respond, Samantha appeared at his side, as if she had timed her entrance. She carried an iced coffee in one hand and a designer tote in the other, her outfit a coordinated display of effortless expense. She leaned down to kiss Jason on the cheek before sliding into the booth next to him. "We were just talking about this," she said brightly. "Family money should stay in the family. No point in getting hung up on formalities, it just creates bad energy." Linda's gaze was sharp as she replied, "That's why we put it in writing. To keep things clear." Reaching into her tote, she withdrew the folder she had brought. She unzipped the leather cover and placed the promissory note on the table, turning it so Jason could see his own signature printed neatly on the bottom line. 5% interest, minimum monthly payments. You've made none of them." Samantha raised her eyebrows, her tone edged with disbelief. "You actually brought paperwork." "That's what legal agreements are," Linda said. "Paperwork." Jason glanced at the document without reading more than the first few lines. "Mom, that was just to make you feel secure. You knew I'd take care of you when things got better." "I knew what we agreed on," Linda replied. Her years as a CPA had trained her to separate feelings from figures, but the habit didn't dull the sting of watching her own son treat their agreement as optional. Math doesn't run on intentions. Jason gave a small laugh, though it sounded thin. "Are you really going to drag your own son into court over this? That's harsh." Her eyes didn't move from his. "If that's what it takes to get paid, yes." A moment of silence hung between them, broken only by the hiss of the espresso machine and the muted chatter from the tables around them. Samantha's polite smile faltered, replaced by something more brittle. Jason leaned forward, lowering his voice. "If I start sending you checks now, I'll slow the business down. We're finally in stride, Mom. You've seen the condo. You know we're building something." "You're not struggling," Linda said, her gaze flicking to the expensive watch on his wrist and the gleam of Samantha's ring. "You're comfortable." Jason sat back, smirking again as though the conversation amused him. "So what are you going to do, sue me?" Linda slid the document back into her folder and zipped it shut. She rose from her seat, adjusting her blouse with careful precision. Placing a $10 bill beside her untouched coffee, she said evenly, "I'm going to get paid." She lifted her tote onto her shoulder and started for the door. Her phone buzzed in the side pocket, and she caught the glow of a text from Evelyn. "County Clerk's office. Doors are open." Without looking back at her son, Linda stepped out into the bright Savannah sunlight. The air smelled faintly of salt drifting in from the river, and the Spanish moss swayed overhead like slow-moving witnesses. Jason might have thought her leaving was the end of the conversation, but Linda knew better. The real beginning was still ahead. Linda unlocked the front door to her bungalow and stepped into the cool, quiet interior. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and the gardenia bush blooming outside the living room window. She set her tote on the hall table and slipped off her shoes, letting the silence settle around her. In here, the noise of the cafe, Jason's casual tone, Samantha's polished condescension, all of it, was muted, almost as if it had happened in another world. But the weight of it remained. She crossed into the small home office at the back of the house, a room she had kept orderly since her days balancing ledgers for clients. The oak desk sat beneath a framed print of the Savannah riverfront, the drawers neatly labeled. From the bottom one, she pulled a thick manila folder, its tab marked in tidy block letters, "Jason Harper Loan." She had touched it so many times over the past 2 years that the paper edges were worn soft. She carried it to the desk, sat down, and laid everything out with the precision of habit. The promissory note was right on top, its ink as dark and uncompromising as the day they'd signed it. Date, amount, interest rate, 5%, repayment schedule, signatures in black pen. No room for confusion, no legal wiggle. The knock at the side door was light but familiar. Linda smiled faintly and called out, "Come on in, Evelyn." Her oldest friend entered with a gust of warm air and the scent of her favorite Earl Grey. "I brought the good tea," Evelyn said, setting the thermos on the desk before lowering herself into the chair opposite. She was dressed for comfort, not show, in soft slacks and a cardigan, but her eyes were sharp, the same eyes that had once caught a dozen forged signatures in a single afternoon when she worked at the bank. Linda slid the note across the desk. Evelyn adjusted her glasses, scanned the page, and gave a low whistle. "Ironclad. He doesn't have a leg to stand on." "I know," Linda said, her voice level, but her fingers smoothed the paper as if reassuring it. Evelyn unscrewed the thermos and poured tea into 2 cups, the steam curling upward between them. "So, what's your move?" Linda pulled a legal pad closer, flipped to a fresh sheet, and began writing numbers. Her pen moved with the same certainty it had when she managed million-dollar accounts. Principal, $50,000. Interest accrued over 24 months, $8,125. Total due, $58,125. Seeing it written down, the extra $8,000 felt less like an abstract calculation and more like a line Jason had crossed without even noticing. "He's going to pretend the interest doesn't count," Evelyn said, sipping her tea. "That's fine," Linda replied. "Courts know how to read." When Evelyn left, promising to call Charles Benton if Linda needed him, the house fell into its quiet rhythm again. Afternoon light angled through the blinds, striping the desk. Linda reached for her tablet to check the day's news, but a familiar name caught her eye in her social media feed before she could scroll past. Samantha. There she was, perfectly framed in the glossy lobby of some new boutique hotel downtown, tagged at number Savannah style. The caption read, "Investing in luxury over debt, because you can't build an empire on penny pinching." Linda's mouth went dry. It was casual enough to pass for generic inspiration, but the timing was too precise, the wording too pointed. She tapped the screen to expand the photo. Samantha's hand rested on Jason's arm, his watch glinting under the chandelier, their smiles effortless for the camera. Linda's thumb moved without hesitation. She took one screenshot, then another for safety, then saved the entire page. Years of balancing other people's books had taught her that paper trails weren't just for accountants. They were for anyone who intended to win. She set the tablet down and looked at the folder again. The note sat there, patient and undeniable. It didn't care about tone or timing or whether someone thought a loan was just family. It simply waited to be enforced. The sun dipped lower, the house growing a shade dimmer. Outside, the gardenia bush stirred in the breeze, scattering white petals onto the lawn. Linda closed the folder and slid it into her briefcase, the one she used when she meant business. She turned off the desk lamp, the office falling into shadow, and walked toward the kitchen. Tomorrow, she would begin the next step. Tonight, she would sleep well, knowing that the paper in her possession could change everything. But as she reached for the light switch, her phone vibrated on the counter. A new message from Evelyn lit the screen. "I know someone at the clerk's office. You're going to want to hear this." Linda stood still for a moment, the glow of the phone casting a faint halo on her palm. Then she smiled. Slow, certain, and without a trace of hesitation. The next morning dawned bright and heavy with the smell of salt drifting in from the river. Linda dressed with the same precision she used for client meetings in her working years. Pressed slacks, a crisp blouse, low-heeled shoes that made no sound on polished floors. She slipped the Jason Harper loan folder into her leather briefcase and locked the front door behind her. The Chatham County Clerk's office stood like an old sentinel in the middle of downtown, columns weathered by decades of Savannah sun, glass doors reflecting the swirl of mossy oaks across the street. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of paper and toner. Charles Benton was already there, waiting near the information desk. He stood tall despite his 72 years, his gray suit impeccable, his tie knotted just so. When he saw her, his lined face softened into something like approval. "Punctual as always, Linda," he said, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who'd argued his share of cases. "Habit," she replied, shaking his hand. They moved together down the corridor to the records department, where a clerk in a navy sweater sat behind a counter stacked with file trays. Linda placed her folder on the counter, opening it to reveal the promissory note, her neatly typed interest calculations, and a cover letter Charles had drafted. "This is everything you'll need," Charles told the clerk, his tone polite but unmistakably firm. "We're filing a lien against the property at 415 Whitaker Street, Unit 3B, debt plus interest." The clerk glanced over the paperwork, then began tapping at her keyboard. Linda watched the screen's reflection in the clerk's glasses, each keystroke locking her son's name more firmly into public record. When the clerk handed her the stamped copy, the sound of the paper sliding across the counter was more satisfying than she expected. Charles gave a small nod, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "You've just made yourself a secured creditor." They walked together back through the lobby, their shoes echoing off the marble. Linda's mind felt oddly clear, not triumphant but focused, like the quiet before a tide changed. Stepping outside, she was greeted by the soft rustle of Spanish moss in the breeze and the faint hum of traffic. And then she saw her. Marta Flores, standing by the sidewalk in her crisp building manager's uniform, a clipboard tucked under one arm. Her dark eyes flicked from Linda to the stamped envelope in her hand. One eyebrow lifted, a question without a word. Linda hesitated only a second before walking over. "Marta," she said, lowering her voice, "I just filed a lien against Jason's condo." Marta's lips curved, not quite a smile but close. "I thought something was going on," she murmured. "Don't worry, I'll keep you informed if I hear activity." Linda met her gaze and saw genuine loyalty there, the kind that couldn't be bought with tips or holiday cards. "Thank you," she said. As they parted ways, Linda felt the warmth of knowing she had an ally inside Jason's building, one who noticed things. Later that afternoon, over tea at Linda's kitchen table, Evelyn leaned back in her chair as Linda told her what had happened. "A lien," Evelyn said with a chuckle. "That's going to be fun for him." Linda arched a brow. "Fun? Oh, yes. Nothing like finding out your property's wearing a legal shackle. Contractors hate it, lenders hate it, and I imagine Samantha will hate it most of all." Linda allowed herself the faintest smile. "He's talking about doing some renovations." Evelyn laughed outright, the sound warm and unrestrained. Even better, let's see how far he gets when every dollar spent still leaves you holding the deed to his peace of mind. The image was satisfying, but Linda didn't linger on it. She had taken one step, and there were more ahead. Outside, the light was slipping toward gold, shadows lengthening across the lawn. Somewhere across town, Jason was making plans, unaware that the foundation beneath them had just shifted, and tomorrow she intended to make sure that shift became impossible to ignore. The invitation arrived in Linda's mailbox, folded into a thick cream envelope, her name written in Samantha's looping script. There was no return address, but the embossed gold letters inside left little doubt. Before and after, Condo Reveal Party, Whitaker Street, Saturday, 7 p.m. It was the kind of stationery that announced not just an event, but the hostess's sense of her own importance. Linda placed it on the kitchen counter and stared at it for a long moment. She hadn't been mentioned in weeks, not since filing the lien. An invitation now wasn't an olive branch, it was an afterthought, a box to check so no one could say she hadn't been included. Saturday evening arrived warm and heavy, the street lamps casting soft halos over the Victorian district. Linda dressed in slate-gray linen and pearls, clothes that spoke of quiet refinement rather than spectacle, and walked up the condo's front steps. The scent of polished wood and fresh paint hit her as soon as Marta opened the door. "Evening, Mrs. Harper," Marta said with that knowing glint in her eye. "Elevators to your left." The condo gleamed like a magazine spread. New quartz counters reflected the pendant lights in the kitchen, a waterfall island cut from marble. The floors had been stripped and refinished to a deep honey tone, rugs layered in strategic places. Guests mingled in little knots, glasses of wine in hand, their conversation a steady hum of admiration. Samantha floated through the crowd in a fitted emerald dress, greeting people with the air of a politician on the campaign trail. Jason followed behind her, laughing at jokes, topping off glasses, nodding as friends praised the transformation. Linda stood near the French doors to the balcony, letting the breeze slip in from the street below. She sipped from a glass of Merlot and listened without trying to the lines drifting past her. "Can you believe the backsplash? This must have cost a fortune. Perfect for entertaining." She was turning toward the kitchen when a man in a contractor's polo stepped into her path. His hands were calloused, his expression not unfriendly, but edged with frustration. "You're Jason's mom, right?" "I am," Linda said evenly. He glanced over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening, then lowered his voice. "We still haven't been paid for some of this. Half the cabinet install, the bathroom tile, still outstanding. He keeps saying the funds are coming, but—" The man hesitated, as if weighing whether to go further. Linda let him finish the thought himself. She raised her glass slightly and said in a tone soft enough for only him to hear, "You might want to check the property records." His brow furrowed. "Property records?" She didn't elaborate. She simply met his eyes, took a slow sip of wine, and moved past him into the living room. It didn't take long for the ripple to spread. The contractor drifted toward a small cluster of guests, 2 men in suits, a woman in a sleek black dress, and murmured something. One of the men pulled out his phone, tapping quickly. Another leaned toward Samantha, who forced a brittle laugh and waved a dismissive hand. By the time Linda returned to the balcony, she could feel it in the air, the shift from casual admiration to something sharper, speculative. Snatches of conversation floated past her, questions asked in lowered voices, names repeated with a certain tone. Marta's words from days ago echoed in Linda's mind. "I'll keep you informed if I hear activity." Across the room, Jason caught her eye. His smile was still in place, but there was a faint tightness in it now, as if he could sense the current changing, but couldn't see exactly where it had begun. Linda let the glass rest lightly in her hand and looked out over the city. The warm night air carried the scent of blooming jasmine and the distant sound of a trolley bell. Inside, the hum of conversation swelled just a little, edged now with the quiet rustle of gossip taking root. She didn't need to say anything more. The seed had been planted, and she knew from long experience that certain seeds didn't just grow, they spread. Jason's kitchen smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the faint metallic tang of new appliances. The quartz island gleamed under recessed lights. every inch of the space still carrying that just-renovated air Samantha had been so eager to showcase. Linda set her leather briefcase on the counter and unlatched the brass clasp with deliberate care. Jason leaned against the far counter with his arms folded, wearing a half-buttoned shirt like he'd been interrupted mid-morning. Samantha was there too, perched on a stool, phone in hand, scrolling without looking up. "I appreciate you coming over," Jason said, his tone falsely warm. "I'm sure you do," Linda replied. She reached into the briefcase and removed 2 documents, sliding them onto the counter one at a time. First, the promissory note, its pages flat and clean, every term visible in crisp black ink. Then the county's stamped lien filing, official seal and recording number at the top, Jason's name and condo address printed in stark block letters. Jason glanced down, then back up at her with a thin smile. It's just a formality." Linda didn't bother answering him. She reached into her purse for her phone and tapped the screen. A second later, Charles Benton's deep, even voice filled the kitchen over speaker. "Jason," Charles said without preamble, "there's nothing just a formality about a recorded lien. It's a public claim against your property. Until the debt is satisfied in full, you can't sell, refinance, or transfer it without clearing her interest." Jason's smile twitched, but he kept his eyes on Linda. "Charles, we're family here. My mother's not going to force this." "On the contrary," Charles said smoothly, "she already has. My advice, settle. Quickly. Every month you delay, interest keeps accruing. And in this county, foreclosure isn't a theoretical outcome. It's a scheduled process." Samantha snapped her head up from her phone, eyes sharp. "This is vindictive. You're punishing us for what? For living a little? For trying to make a life here?" Linda kept her gaze steady on her son. "I'm holding you to the agreement you made. The life you've built shouldn't come at the cost of walking away from your debts." Samantha's cheeks flushed, her voice rising. "It's petty, Linda. You could have asked nicely. You didn't have to drag in lawyers and paperwork and liens. You've made it ugly." Evelyn's voice floated into the room before Linda could answer. She had stepped in through the open door from the hallway, a cup of coffee in hand. "It's just business," she said, as if remarking on the weather. She took a slow sip. "Like Jason always says." Jason's gaze flicked toward Evelyn, his smirk holding for a second too long. Then, like a photograph curling at the edges, it began to fade. He shifted his stance, uncrossing his arms, suddenly less certain. "Look," he said finally, pushing away from the counter. "I can move some things around, maybe make a partial payment." "No," Linda interrupted. "Full payment plus interest, that's the deal you made." He opened his mouth, but no words came. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the muted city noise filtering through the balcony doors. Linda gathered her documents into a neat stack and slid them back into her briefcase. She snapped the clasp shut with a quiet click. "When you're ready to treat this seriously," she said, "call me." She turned to go, Evelyn falling into step beside her. Behind them, Jason stood in his spotless, newly renovated kitchen, staring at the official seal still stamped into his mind even though the paper was gone. Samantha muttered something under her breath, but it was lost under the sound of the front door opening. As Linda stepped into the hallway, she caught a final glimpse of her son's face. No smirk now, just the shadow of someone beginning to realize that what had once felt like a bluff might actually be the first move in a game he didn't know how to win. The notice came on heavy cream paper with a county seal pressed deep into its surface, the kind of document that didn't need bold letters to command attention. Jason found it in the small stack of mail Marta had left at his door, wedged between a glossy furniture catalog and a flyer for a wine tasting downtown. He read the first paragraph twice, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less final. Initiation of foreclosure proceedings pursuant to the lien recorded. His hand tightened around the page until the edges bent. By the time Samantha came home, he was pacing the kitchen, the letter lying flat on the counter like a threat. She skimmed it once and went pale. "This can't be real. There's still time to fix it. We just need—" Her voice caught, then softened into a plea. "I'll talk to her." I'll make her listen." 2 days later, she appeared on Linda's porch, hair pulled back in a careful braid, makeup done but not overdone. The late morning sun caught the gold in her earrings as she clasped her hands in front of her. "Linda," she began, forcing a smile, "I know things have been tense, but we're just asking, for a little more time. Jason's expecting a payout from a project. We can make this right if you just extend the deadline." Linda held the screen door between them, her own expression calm. "The deadline was 2 years ago. You've had an extension every day since then." Samantha's voice dropped. "You don't have to do this to your own family." Linda didn't flinch. "I'm not doing this to my family. I'm doing this for myself. The papers have been filed. The process is in motion." For a moment, Samantha seemed about to say something sharp, but instead she stepped back, her eyes narrowing. "You're making a mistake," she said softly. Linda closed the door without replying. That afternoon, Evelyn sat at Linda's kitchen table, the foreclosure notice in hand. She fetched her reading glasses from her bag, scanned the dates, and made a small check mark on her desk calendar. "Auction's set for 6 weeks from now," she said, capping her pen. "Plenty of time for him to sweat, but not enough to do much else." Linda poured tea for them both. "I'm done chasing him." "You don't need to," Evelyn said, tapping the notice. "This paper will do the chasing for you." Across town, the pressure was already showing. Marta called one evening, her voice low and tinged with satisfaction. "He's been at it with the contractors all day," she reported, yelling in the hallway about change orders and delays. One of them threatened to walk if he doesn't get paid by Friday. Samantha was trying to smooth things over, but it wasn't working. Linda listened, a faint smile tugging at her mouth. "Thank you for letting me know." She ended the call, put on her walking shoes, and headed out into the late spring twilight. Her route wound through the oak-lined streets of Ardsley Park, past tidy lawns and porches strung with warm lights. Neighbors waved. She waved back, her pace steady. The air was soft with the scent of magnolia, the sky painted in deepening shades of rose and violet. While Jason's days were narrowing into frantic calls and late-night calculations, hers had widened into something simpler: morning coffee, a quiet walk, the knowledge that the clock was working in her favor for once. The calls started on the 5th day after the notice went out. At first, Jason left messages. "Call me, Mom." Then, "We need to talk." By the end of the week, the voicemails were shorter, more clipped, until finally there were no words at all, just the hollow click of the line disconnecting. Linda let them all go unanswered. One evening, she returned from her walk to find a single envelope slid under her front door. No name on the outside, just her address in a rushed hand. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, torn from a legal pad. 3 words in Jason's handwriting: "We need time." She set it on the counter, smoothed the page flat with her palm, and glanced at the calendar hanging by the fridge. The auction date sat there, circled in red, as immovable as the tide. The meeting took place in the back corner of a quiet cafe on Broughton Street, the kind of spot where conversations stayed tucked inside 4 walls. Linda had chosen it on purpose. Neutral ground, no memories to muddy the air. Jason was already there when she arrived, leaning forward at the small table, a cup of coffee cooling untouched in front of him. Samantha sat beside him, posture stiff, lips pressed into a line. Linda noticed her wedding ring turn slightly on her finger when she folded her hands. Linda set her briefcase on the floor and took the chair opposite them. "Let's hear it," she said. Jason cleared his throat, sliding a folded sheet of paper across the table. "Here's the deal. We'll pay half now, today, and the rest, when we can. Things are tight, but this way you get something right away and we can avoid all this ugliness." Linda didn't touch the paper. "Half now, half later," she repeated, as if trying the words on for size. Then she shook her head. "Full payment, plus the accrued interest and fees. That's the agreement you signed." Jason's mouth twitched into a forced smile. "Come on, Mom. That's not realistic." "What wasn't realistic," she said evenly, "was you thinking you could borrow $50,000 and decide the terms after the fact." Samantha leaned forward, her voice sharp now. "Do you even hear yourself? You're driving a wedge into your own family, into our marriage. Jason hasn't been sleeping. I've been stressed out of my mind. And for what? Some principle you can't let go of? Linda's gaze didn't waver. A strong marriage can survive paying its debts. Samantha's face flushed, her breath catching. You think this is about a lesson? Linda didn't answer. She didn't have to. From the next table, Evelyn appeared with a cup of tea in hand, as if she'd simply wandered in. She settled into the empty chair beside Linda without asking. I thought I'd join you, she said mildly, then looked straight at Jason. And before you decide to push this any further, you should know. Interest accrues daily. Every day you stall, the number goes up. Jason exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. This is ridiculous. You're both ganging up on me. No, Evelyn said, we're both pointing at the same math. The numbers don't care who's family and who's not. Jason pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the floor. Forget it, he said, snatching the paper back. If you won't meet me halfway, then there's nothing to talk about. Samantha followed, tossing her napkin onto the table, her heels clicking sharply as they headed for the door. Linda sat still, the clink of Evelyn's teaspoon in her cup the only sound between them. Through the front window, she watched Jason stalk across the sidewalk, shoulders tight, jaw set. Samantha was talking fast, gesturing sharply, but he didn't turn his head. Linda let the image settle in her mind before she reached for her own tea. Jason thought walking away meant ending the conversation. She knew better. The clock was still running, and the next sound he heard from her would be louder than any offer he'd just taken off the table. It started with a phone call to someone Linda hadn't spoken to in years. Thomas Greer had made his fortune in commercial real estate, office parks, mixed-use developments, a handful of high-end condo flips. He'd been a client once, back when Linda still kept other people's books. And he'd been one of the few who treated her like more than a service line on an invoice. Unit 3B on Whitaker? He said after she explained, his voice smooth and curious. Prime corner, high ceilings, balcony, elevator access. You sure you want me sniffing around? That's your boy's place. That's my collateral, Linda corrected. And I'm sure. 2 days later, Marta called. If your friend wanted to swing by, she said in a voice pitched just above a whisper, now would be a good time. Jason's home, and he's in one of his let me tell you how great my life is moods. Thomas arrived in a linen shirt and loafers, sunglasses perched on his head. He carried no briefcase, no clipboard, just the easy air of a man dropping in on a social call. Marta met him in the lobby, greeting him with a warmth that didn't spill over into performance. Jason opened the condo door before she could knock, grinning. Hey, Marta, who's this? Old friend of mine, Marta said smoothly. He's always admired the building. Thought you wouldn't mind showing off a little. Jason stepped back, holding the door wide. Sure, come on in. Can't hurt to have another fan of the place. The condo was still magazine perfect from the reveal party. Afternoon light poured in through the balcony doors, gilding the marble island and glinting off the polished fixtures. Jason gestured expansively as they moved through the rooms. You can't beat the location, he said, walking distance to Forsyth, 2 blocks from River Street. You hear the trolley bells, but not enough to bother you. HOA keeps the place immaculate, thanks to Marta here. Thomas nodded appreciatively, his eyes scanning with a professional's precision. The depth of the closets, the quality of the trim, the faint hairline crack in the ceiling near the guest bath. It's a beautiful unit, he said. Though if I were to admire it more formally, I'd need to know what's on record at the county. Jason blinked. On record? Thomas smiled as if he'd misspoken. You know, property history, liens, that sort of thing. Part of the business. The shift in Jason's expression was subtle, but there, something guarded slipping in behind his easy grin. Yeah, well, everything's fine there. Of course, Thomas said, letting the words hang with deliberate lightness. From the kitchen, Samantha appeared, a glass of white wine in hand. Hi there, she said brightly, extending a hand. I'm Samantha. Thomas took it politely, his eyes flicking to the diamond at her finger before moving back to her face. Pleasure. She turned to Jason. Did I hear something about county records? Jason waved her off. Nothing important, just shop talk. But Samantha's smile didn't quite recover. She took a sip of wine, the faint crease between her brows deepening as she glanced from Thomas to Marta and then toward the balcony, where Evelyn sat in the courtyard below, sipping an iced tea as if she had all the time in the world. Thomas wandered to the balcony doors. "Mind if I step out?" "Go ahead," Jason said, but his voice lacked the earlier ease. Outside, Thomas leaned on the railing, looking down at the courtyard. Evelyn tilted her glass in a lazy salute. It was impossible to tell whether she was toasting him or the fact that everything was moving exactly as Linda had planned. Inside, Samantha's gaze lingered on the man she'd just met, the one who asked too few questions to be just a friend. The courthouse smelled faintly of varnish and old paper, the kind of air that seemed to hum with 100 past arguments. Linda arrived early, as she always did, her briefcase in hand. Thomas Greer walked beside her in a tailored navy jacket, casual enough to look like an observer, sharp enough to be taken seriously by anyone paying attention. Charles Benton was already inside, seated near the front, a folder neatly stacked before him. He rose when he saw them, his expression calm but alert. "All the filings are in order," he said, voice pitched low. "They can posture, but the clock ran out weeks ago." Jason arrived minutes later with Samantha at his side, both dressed as if they were there for a real estate closing rather than a foreclosure hearing. Jason carried a thick binder, the edges bristling with colored tabs, as though sheer bulk could sway a judge. Samantha's chin was high, her lipstick an exact, deliberate shade of defiance. When the clerk called the case, they stepped forward to the long table. The judge, a silver-haired man with an unhurried air, adjusted his glasses and looked over the docket. Jason was first to speak, sliding a sheaf of papers across the bench. "Your Honor, we've brought new documentation that we believe warrants a delay." Charles cut in smoothly. "With respect, Your Honor, nothing in those pages changes the recorded lien, the missed payments, or the statutory timeline. They've had more than the required opportunity to cure the debt." The judge flipped through the top few pages, his brows lowering by degrees. "Mr. Harper, these documents are bank statements and personal notes. They don't address the legal default. The matter proceeds." Jason's jaw tightened. Samantha reached for his arm, but he pulled it just out of her grasp. When the bidding began, the room shifted into a different kind of silence, less formal, more charged. The opening number was called, low enough to draw in anyone looking for a bargain. Thomas's voice was steady when he offered the first bid. Another investor countered, but without conviction. It was clear Thomas had done his homework, and he was the only one in the room willing to edge upward with purpose. Jason sat rigid, watching each number climb, though still far below what the condo was worth on the open market. Samantha's hands gripped the binder in her lap until the corners bent. When the gavel finally fell, Thomas's bid stood as the winner, well below market value, well below what Jason would have imagined losing it for. Samantha rose quickly, the binder slipping from her lap and hitting the floor with a flat smack. She didn't pick it up. Instead, she turned and walked out, her heels echoing sharp against the marble before fading down the hall. Jason stayed frozen for a moment longer, staring at the judge's bench as if waiting for someone to call him back. No one did. After the hearing, they stepped into the hallway where the late morning light streamed through high windows. Charles handed Linda a pen and the final set of documents. She signed with a steady hand, the ink flowing in neat, unbroken strokes. The lien that had hung over Jason's property was now in Thomas's hands, but only because Thomas had already agreed, in writing, to exchange the value for a cashier's check made out to Linda Harper, covering the full debt plus every cent of her legal costs. When the pen lifted from the page, Linda closed the folder and looked up. Jason stood at the far end of the corridor, watching, his expression unreadable. For the first time since this began, she didn't feel the urge to read it. Charles slipped the signed copy into his briefcase. "That's that," he said quietly. Linda adjusted her jacket and turned toward the doors, the click of her heels crisp against the tile. Behind her, the courthouse carried on with its day, but for her, the air felt lighter, like the shift after a storm, when you know the damage is done but the sky has cleared. She didn't look back. There were still more moves to make. The movers came on a Tuesday morning, their box truck rumbling up Whitaker Street and idling in the curb lane. The May sun was already warm, glaring off the condo's glass facade. From her office window at the Ardsley Park bungalow, Linda could picture the scene before Marta even called. "They're here," Marta said over the line, her voice as even as ever, but carrying that undercurrent of satisfaction she never bothered to hide when it came to Jason. Investor gave them 72 hours. We're at hour 71. By the time Linda arrived, the building's front doors were propped open with a folded furniture pad. A dolly squeaked under the weight of cardboard boxes stamped with high-end appliance logos. The lobby smelled faintly of fresh paint and the ghost of whatever scented candle Samantha favored. Marta stood at the front desk, clipboard in hand, watching the procession like an air traffic controller. "Morning, Mrs. Harper," she said, jotting down the serial numbers of a pair of matching end tables as they rolled past. Jason appeared from the elevator, his shirt untucked, hair a little too neat in the way that suggested effort to look unbothered. He nodded to Marta but didn't look toward Linda. Upstairs, the condo was a shell in transition. The quartz counters were bare except for a stack of flattened moving boxes. The living room echoed faintly without the rugs. One wall showed a pale rectangle where a framed mirror had hung, the paint beneath still richer from years without sunlight. Samantha was in the bedroom, directing two movers as they maneuvered a dresser toward the door. She didn't speak to Linda, didn't even offer the tight smile she'd worn in other awkward encounters. The faint clink of jewelry boxes sliding into a tote was the only sound she made. Linda walked through slowly, her steps measured. She traced the perimeter of the balcony with her eyes, noting the view of the park, the faint ring left by a potted plant. In the guest room, she opened the closet and found it empty except for a single drawer left ajar in the built-in. Inside was a small bundle of faded flannel, Connor's baby blanket, the one Linda had sewn when her grandson was still just a heartbeat on an ultrasound. The fabric was soft with age, the pattern of tiny blue sailboats worn almost smooth. She folded it once, then again, and held it a moment longer than she meant to before tucking it under her arm. Marta's voice carried in from the hall. "Investor's rep will be here in an hour for the keys." In the kitchen, Evelyn leaned against the counter, a paper coffee cup in hand. She'd been waiting, patient as ever. "Not a bad place for poker nights," she said, glancing around. "Plenty of light. Easy to clean. Balcony for fresh air between hands." Linda smiled faintly. "We'll see what Thomas thinks." The last load rolled out, a leather sofa wrapped in moving blankets, Samantha trailing behind it with her purse slung over her shoulder. Jason followed, carrying nothing. He kept his eyes fixed on the hallway ahead, passing within arm's length of Linda without a word or a glance. When the elevator doors closed on them, Marta set her clipboard down. "And that's that," she said quietly. Linda stepped to the center of the now empty living room. The quiet was different here now. Less like the hush of anticipation, more like the stillness after a storm. She could almost hear the echo of her own footsteps the day she'd first walked in with the lien papers in her bag. She turned toward the balcony, the sunlight spilling across the floor in long, unbroken lines, and thought about how quickly a space could change hands when paper and patience were on your side. In her bag, the baby blanket lay folded and weightless, but when she touched it, the years between then and now compressed into something sharp, and that sharpness was exactly why she wasn't finished yet. 2 weeks later, a different moving truck pulled up to the curb in front of the Whitaker Street building. No battered cardboard boxes this time, no hand-scribbled labels or personal knickknacks peeking out from half-sealed cartons. This truck was a gleaming white panel van with a discreet blue and silver logo stenciled across its side. Garrison and Company. Corporate Housing Solutions. The movers wore matching uniforms and worked in precise formation, wheeling in shrink-wrapped armchairs, low-slung leather sofas, and sleek desks that looked like they belonged in a downtown law office. The furniture was modern, spotless, and designed to fit like a puzzle inside the unit. No guesswork, no sentimentality. Linda stood across the street with a paper cup of coffee, watching them move with quiet efficiency. Marta, stationed at the front desk, caught sight of her through the glass and gave a small wave, then returned to signing off on the incoming inventory. By noon, the balcony doors of Unit 3B were open, letting in the spring breeze as a pair of movers adjusted a framed cityscape over the mantel. Inside, the space looked transformed again, polished and impersonal, ready for a revolving door of executives who would treat it like a hotel room. That afternoon, Thomas handed Linda an envelope over coffee at the cafe on Bull Street. "First month's rent," he said, tapping the seal. "As agreed." Linda slid the check halfway out, the neat row of zeros lining up like soldiers. She folded it back into place, tucking it in her bag without lingering. The money mattered. Of course it did, but so did what it represented. A steady return, predictable and clean, untouched by the chaos that had preceded it. The next morning, Jason happened to be walking down Whitaker when a pair of movers wheeled in the last load, a stack of flat-packed crates stamped with the Garrison and Company logo. He stopped mid-step, frowning, his gaze following the boxes as they disappeared into the lobby. His jaw worked as if he might say something, but no words came. From a half-step behind him, Samantha finally broke the silence. "Corporate rental," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "What a waste. This place could have been anything. Now it's just a cash register for strangers." Jason didn't answer. He just shoved his hands in his pockets and kept walking. Evelyn was already on Linda's porch when she got home that evening, sitting in her favorite chair with a glass of iced tea. Linda handed her the check, and Evelyn whistled low. "That," she said, fanning herself with the paper, "is the sound of income." They sat for a while, listening to the evening sounds. Distant traffic, a mockingbird calling from the magnolia tree, the creak of wood settling as the heat began to fade. Linda thought about the quiet, ordered life she'd built for herself, and how easily someone else's chaos could have taken root in it if she hadn't acted. Later that week, she treated herself to dinner at one of the old brick restaurants along River Street. She chose a table by the window where she could watch the cargo ships slip past on the dark water. The waiter brought her a plate of pecan-crusted trout, the skin crisp, the sauce tangy and rich. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, the low murmur of other diners' conversations wrapping around her like a soft blanket. Outside, the river glinted under the lamplight, the tide moving steadily toward the sea. Linda lifted her glass of wine in a small, private toast, not to victory exactly, but to balance. She knew Jason had seen the moving boxes. She knew the knowledge of what they represented would sit with him longer than any argument she could have made. And she knew, without question, that the next move would be hers. The notice came in a plain white envelope, the return address stamped from the county courthouse. Inside was a single-page filing. Notice of appeal. Jason Harper, appellant. Basis: verbal forgiveness of loan. Linda read it twice, then set it down on the kitchen table beside her coffee. The words were almost laughable, but the attempt itself didn't surprise her. Jason had always believed that saying something with enough conviction could make it true. 3 weeks later, she walked into the same courthouse where she'd signed over the lien. The air inside felt just as cool and still as before, but this time there was less anticipation, more inevitability. Evelyn walked beside her, a bright scarf knotted at her neck, her expression a blend of support and quiet amusement. Jason and Samantha were already seated at the appellant's table. He wore a suit that fit well but looked borrowed from a better version of himself. Samantha's dress was sharp, her hair perfectly smoothed, but her eyes flicked restlessly toward the gallery as if hoping for an audience. The judge, a different one from the foreclosure hearing, took his seat and adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Harper," he began, "you claim that the loan in question was verbally forgiven by the lender. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Jason said, voice steady. "We had an understanding, off the record, that repayment was no longer expected. Family arrangement." Linda's attorney didn't rise immediately. She opened her folder, slid out 3 documents, and laid them side by side on the table before her. The signed promissory note, the recorded lien, and a payment history printed in black and red ink. When she stood, her voice was calm, but carried easily in the quiet room. "Your Honor, the note includes specific repayment terms signed by both parties. The lien was filed upon default. The payment history shows no record of repayment and no correspondence indicating forgiveness. There is no legal basis for his claim." The judge picked up the note, scanned the first page, then set it down with finality. Mr. Harper, a verbal statement, if it even occurred, does not override a signed and executed contract, particularly when followed by a recorded lien and subsequent foreclosure. This appeal has no merit. The gavel struck once, sharp and unambiguous. Dismissed. For a moment, the only sound was the creak of chairs as people rose. Samantha stood abruptly, her heels biting into the polished floor as she strode toward the doors. She didn't look back. Jason lingered just long enough for their eyes to meet, hers steady, his unreadable, before following her out. Evelyn exhaled slowly, then wrapped Linda in a brief but solid hug. "Well," she murmured, "that was efficient." Outside, the morning sun fell in bright bars across the courthouse steps. The air smelled faintly of wisteria drifting in from the square. Evelyn squeezed Linda's arm. "You know, I almost wish it had taken longer. I was enjoying the show." Linda smiled faintly but didn't reply. The matter was done. Not settled, because that implied mutual agreement, but done in the only way that mattered. That afternoon, a delivery van pulled into her driveway. Marta climbed out from the passenger seat, carrying a square box wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "Thought you might like these," she said, handing it over. Inside was a glass vase filled with fresh-cut lilies and pale pink roses. A small card was tucked among the stems. "For the lady who always finishes what she starts." Linda set the vase in the center of her kitchen table, the flowers catching the late-day light. She traced one petal with her fingertip, its edges soft but resilient, and she thought, quietly without a hint of triumph, that she was far from finished. The idea took root over breakfast. A simple note scrawled in the corner of the local business section, "Investor sells Whitaker unit to private buyer." Linda read it twice before folding the paper neatly beside her coffee cup. By the end of the week, she had met Thomas at his office overlooking Johnson Square. He stood behind his desk, a glass wall framing the green canopy outside, and tapped the listing contract with a single finger. "You really want to own it outright?" he asked. "I'm happy to keep holding it. The tenant's solid, the rent's steady." Linda rested her hands on the polished edge of his desk. "I want the deed in my name. I've run the numbers. Between my pension savings and what I've already made in rent, it's not just possible, it's profitable." Thomas studied her for a moment, then smiled the kind of smile reserved for people who knew exactly what they wanted and had the means to take it. "All right, Linda, let's make it happen." 2 weeks later, the papers were signed in a quiet corner of Charles Benton's office. He read each page aloud in his deliberate courtroom voice, the one that left no room for misunderstanding. When he handed her the final page, she took the pen without hesitation. "There," Charles said, sliding the deed toward her, "you just turned a delinquent loan into full ownership of a prime Savannah condo. That's more than winning, it's converting debt into equity." Linda allowed herself a small smile. "Feels cleaner this way." The tenant, Garrison and Company, renewed on the spot for a 3-year term. The new lease came printed on thick stock, each clause as precise as an accountant's ledger. Monthly rent, indexed increases, maintenance terms, predictable, professional, free of drama. That Friday, Marta called as Linda was watering the gardenia bush in her front yard. "Your unit's secure for 3 years," she reported. "Corporate's sending a team next week to swap in some new furniture. Very slick operation." And then, almost as an afterthought, "Jason stopped by today." Linda kept her voice neutral. "Oh?" "He asked who owns 3B now. I told him the truth. You should have seen his jaw, could have cracked the marble in the lobby." Linda said nothing for a moment, letting the image settle in her mind. "Thank you, Marta." Across town, Jason relayed the news over dinner to Samantha, but Linda didn't need to imagine the rest. She knew the tilt of his shoulders when he was holding something in, the way his fork would pause mid-air. Samantha's response came by omission. She stopped coming downtown entirely. No more boutique shopping on Broughton, no wine tastings, no carefully staged photos tagged in the Victorian district. When Evelyn heard, she arrived at Linda's porch with a chilled bottle of Prosecco and 2 mismatched glasses. She popped the cork with a flourish and poured, handing one across the table. To compound revenge, Evelyn declared, raising her glass. "The only kind worth waiting for." Linda clinked her glass lightly. "It's not revenge," she said, though the corner of her mouth betrayed her. "It's better," Evelyn replied. "It's return on investment." They drank as the sun dipped low, the street lamps flickering on one by one. Somewhere in the distance, the faint clang of a trolley bell carried on the breeze, the sound threading easily through the quiet. Later that night, Linda sat at her desk, the deed to Unit 3B resting in an open folder. She traced her name where it appeared in bold type, thinking not of Jason's tight jaw or Samantha's absence, but of the steady tick of rent checks that would follow. It was, she realized, the cleanest ending she could have written for this part of the story. But even as she closed the folder, a flicker of something, anticipation maybe, stirred at the edges of her thoughts. Owning the condo outright didn't have to be the last move. Not when she still had capital, not when the market was shifting, not when certain people had underestimated just how far she was willing to go. She looked toward the dark window, her reflection layered over the soft lights of the street outside. The game wasn't over. It had simply changed boards. The impound lot sat just beyond the edge of town, where cracked asphalt met chain-link fence, and the air smelled faintly of oil and cut grass. A man in a grease-stained ball cap led Linda down a row of vehicles with the weary efficiency of someone who'd seen every kind of claim and every kind of claimant. "Yours is the silver coupe," he said, checking her paperwork once more before handing over the keys. "Paid in full." Linda closed her fingers around the key fob, the cool metal pressing into her palm. She hadn't owned a car like this since her 30s, a low, sleek thing built for gliding rather than hauling groceries. When the attendant stepped aside, she ran her hand along the polished curve of the hood, the paint still throwing back the afternoon light in a soft shimmer. The interior smelled faintly of leather and some cologne she didn't recognize. Jason's, she assumed. The thought didn't sting. If anything, it sharpened her satisfaction. She started the engine, the quiet growl settling into a smooth purr, and eased the car toward the gate. By the time she hit the riverside road, the sun was angling low, throwing molten light across the water. The tide was on the turn, tugging the reflections of docked boats into lazy sways. Linda cracked the window just enough to let the breeze in, the faint scent of salt and marsh grass threading through. She kept the music low, an old jazz station, saxophone soft against the hum of the tires on the pavement. Savannah's skyline glowed ahead, the church spires and warehouse rooftops limned in gold. Each turn of the wheel felt deliberate, like tracing a route she'd been meant to take all along. The steering was tight, the acceleration easy, and for a stretch, she let herself forget the tangled history of how this particular car had ended up in her name. As she slowed near Whitaker Street, she caught sight of Marta on the condo steps. Marta lifted one hand in a wave, clipboard tucked under her other arm, eyes flicking from the car to Linda's face with a smile that said, "I know." Linda returned the wave without slowing, the coupe's polished side catching the last streak of sunlight before she turned the corner. Evelyn was waiting on a side street, exactly as planned. She slid into the passenger seat with the delighted laugh of someone stepping into a pleasant conspiracy. "Well, look at you," she said, running a hand over the stitched leather. "I'd say it suits you better than it ever suited him." Linda merged back into traffic, the two of them riding in easy silence for a while, letting the city's late-day hum wrap around them. Evelyn leaned back, one leg crossed over the other, humming along to the radio as if this were just another Sunday drive. They looped the long way home, past the live oaks draped in moss, the shaded streets where porch lights were beginning to glow, the market stalls closing up for the night. Neither of them mentioned Jason. They didn't need to. When they finally pulled into Linda's driveway, the coupe's engine settled into a soft idle before she shut it off. The front walk smelled of blooming gardenia, the porch light catching in the polished chrome as they stepped out. Evelyn whistled low. "Clean, polished, and entirely yours," she said. Linda smiled faintly. "For now, at least." They said their good nights, Evelyn heading down the sidewalk toward her own place. Inside, Linda hung her keys on the small hook by the door, the car now sitting quiet in the drive like a kept promise. She was halfway to the kitchen when her phone buzzed. One new message. Jason, that's mine. No greeting, no punctuation beyond the period, no attempt at persuasion, just a claim, brittle and bare. Linda stared at the words for a moment, then set the phone face down on the counter. Outside, the coupe caught the last glint of lamplight, looking exactly like it belonged there. Linda's desk was an island of order in the soft morning light. The ledger lay open in front of her, columns of neat handwriting alternating with the precise printouts Charles had mailed over last week. One sheet showed the final bank transfer from the foreclosure sale, every dollar of the original loan accounted for, plus interest. Another bore the stamped deed for Unit 3B, now in her name. On the corner of the blotter sat the registration for the silver coupe, her address crisp beneath the embossed state seal. She leaned back, letting her gaze drift to the window. The coupe was parked in the driveway, chrome catching the early sun, a quiet presence that needed no explanation. Out beyond it, the garden hummed with summer life, bees working the azaleas, a mockingbird darting between the fence posts, the faint scent of jasmine threading through the open window. A soft knock on the back door pulled her from the moment. Evelyn let herself in, balancing a wicker tray with 2 mugs of tea and a small plate of shortbread. "Thought I'd save you from working through breakfast," she said, setting the tray down on the kitchen table. Linda closed the ledger and joined her. The tea steamed between them, its faint bergamot scent mingling with the jasmine drifting in from outside. Sunlight pooled across the table, catching the edge of Evelyn's bright scarf. "You look settled," Evelyn said after a sip. "I am," Linda replied, and it was true, not triumphant, not smug, just steady. For a while they talked about small things. The overgrown crepe myrtle on the corner, the upcoming garden tour, the bakery reopening on Habersham, the kind of conversation that flowed best when there was nothing urgent pressing in. A shadow moved across the porch, followed by a firm knock. Marta stood in the doorway, her ever-present clipboard tucked under one arm, a thick envelope in her hand. "Morning," she said, handing it over. Corporate sent the rent check on schedule, not a squeak from the tenant. Everything's running smooth as silk. Linda took the envelope, weighing it briefly before slipping it into the desk drawer where she kept such things until Monday deposits. "Thank you, Marta." "Just keeping the ledger balanced," Marta said with a quick smile before heading back down the walk. Evelyn watched her go, then looked back at Linda. "Feels different, doesn't it? Having it all squared away?" Linda glanced toward the ledger, then to the car outside, and finally to the sunlight filtering through the jasmine leaves. "It's not about having it," she said slowly. "It's about knowing it's mine. All of it. Fair and clear." They finished their tea in comfortable silence. The breeze shifted, carrying the sweet tang of the blossoms deeper into the kitchen. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started, its steady hum a reminder that life kept moving, whether anyone wanted it to or not. When Evelyn finally rose to leave, Linda walked her to the door. The coupe gleamed in the driveway. The condo rent check was filed, the loan repaid in full. Every line item that had once been in red now sat firmly in black. She felt no lingering heat of anger, no echo of the sleepless nights when she'd wondered if this was all worth the strain. What she felt now was something cleaner, a restored symmetry, the kind that didn't need anyone else's recognition to be real. She returned to her desk, opened the ledger once more, and ran her fingertip down the final column. The numbers stood in neat rows, balanced to the penny. Some debts were measured in dollars and those had been paid. Others, well, she'd collected those in quieter currency. She closed the book, the pages settling with a soft whisper, and allowed herself a small, private smile. Some debts are settled in dollars, others in lessons learned.